Okay, I'm with Krystal Creach, and Krystal is one of our employees here at BKD, and I've worked with her on several projects before, and she knows a lot about taxes and nonprofits. So, Krystal, let's start out by talking about the 990 form. It's not just a tax form, it really has a lot more value, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's, like you said, not a tax return. It's actually an information return. And because of that, there's so much more information that the IRS is requesting. On other types of tax returns, it's really just the financial data that they're reporting to the IRS each year. But on a 990, they're really reporting about your policies, reporting about your board. They ask about donor acknowledgement letters. There's pages and pages with tons of questions that's outside of your basic financials. The financial part is only a couple of pages of it, but the bigger piece is all of the information. Are you following for a tax exempt organization? Are you doing what you say you're supposed to in your mission? There's tons of narrative data that talks about what you did throughout the year. A lot of people can use it even as a marketing tool because it is a public document. It's out there on GuideStar, it's out there on Charity Navigator. Anybody can view it, and so it's so important to make sure that you're really reporting accurate information, that it's filed timely with the IRS, that you keep your tax exemption, because your tax exemption is really your most valuable asset as a tax exempt organization. So it is just a piece of it, but it encompasses so much more information that I really encourage people to make sure they are really seeing the value in it and not just filing it like it's a compliance tax return every year.
Mm-hmm. What kind of people are going to be looking at an organization's 990?
So, anybody can go out and look. GuideStar and the IRS website now has one. Charity Navigator is out there. There's lots of different websites that you can go out. You don't even have to pay to see it. It's free information out there. A lot of people that we see looking at it might be potential donors or current donors. Employees might be looking at it to see what's really going on with the organization. You might see a lot of watchdog organizations look at it. Then you can even have a lot of journalists will pull things. So many times it gets pulled from journalists whenever there's some kind of a scandal or something goes on. They go and find the information, see what's been reported, and again, back to the reason why it's so important what you're reporting out there, a lot of times people may never pull it and they may never look at anything until something goes wrong. Then they pull it, and anytime that there's a news article about tax exempt organizations, they almost always reference what was reported on their 990, what was reported for the CEO's compensation, what was reported for what the board members do, what was reported for their percentage of program expenses that they actually spend on their programs. So it's really important to make sure you're involved with that for those people that might be looking at it.
Mm-hmm. So the smaller forms for small organizations are easy and easy to fill out, but when you grow, it gets more complex. So what advice would you give an organization that's moving into that growth period, but they just don't want to spend the money on help?
Right. Yeah, so the jump, there's a 990 in, and they file that if they've got less than 50,000 of gross receipts. It's just a tiny postcard. It takes about 15 minutes, so it's not much that you have to file. The easy is about 4 pages. It's a little bit longer, but you can only file that up to 200,000 of gross receipts. Then beyond that, then you've got the full 990. So it's not huge organizations. It's only $200,000 before you have to start filing the full 990. And once you get into that, there's so much information about policies and the board. And so that's when they really need to evaluate how are they going to be answering the questions on the form. Do they need to invest in some certain types of policies? Do they need to have some more board meetings to go over some things? Do they need to, there's compensation that's reported on there. They need to make sure that everybody knows they're going to see their compensation, and you have to report that or you're really not in compliance. So when you're going to that full 990, I would say as soon as you think you're going to hit that next year, you really need to look through to make sure you're going to have the desired responses to most of those questions. And especially, like I said, policies, document retention and destruction policies, whistleblower policies, conflict of interest policies. Are your bylaws up to date? Have you had the same bylaws for 20 years and you've never reviewed it? It also asks about questions about if you have the 1023 available, which the 1023 is your application for exemption. A lot of organizations, they did it a while ago. Maybe it's somewhere, but they're not sure. Technically, that should always be available. You don't really get asked about it until you get to the full 990, and then you realize you really need to ramp up all your documentation to make sure you're in compliance.
Okay. So now let's switch over and say, we talked about this in class. You join a board and you want to do your job, your fiduciary responsibilities, but you're not an accountant. What are the kinds of things that board members can reasonably do without being an accountant, but without neglecting their responsibility for the financial aspect of being on the board?
Right. Yeah, I see a lot of people that they get on the board, they don't really deal too much with financial things, and so they kind of just say, well, the treasurer's probably taking care of that. I'll let them do their job. But I think you need to take a step beyond that. You need to make sure that there's some checks and balances going on, that it's not just the treasurer taking all the money in, the treasurer paying all the money out, the treasurer reporting everything, and everybody's just trusting the treasurer. You need to have some checks and balances between that, where somebody else is maybe reviewing checks that go out, things like that. When you're joining a board, I think asking some of those questions about what's my responsibilities going to be. Who is monitoring the funds? Am I going to be responsible for the money? Am I going to be on the bank account? Who is on the bank account? And I think when you're getting on a board, you should be able to reasonably ask for prior year financial data. If they have any type of financial statements, whether internal or externally prepared, looking at those financial statements. For a red flag for me would be if I wanted to get on a board and they didn't want to show me any of that, I'd be a little bit concerned about assigning my name to that kind of a board. Of course, you can always go out, even before you are formally asked, you can go out to GuideStar or Charity Navigator or the IRS and pull their 990, kind of look through it and see some of that narrative data about what their mission really is, and does that line up with what you know about the organization and what they're really doing. And so then I would look at all those type of financial aspects, and then make sure that you know what your responsibilities will be as lined out in the bylaws. And so that's kind of goes back to, hopefully they have the bylaws and they could show them to you. But a lot of times people get on boards and there's some kind of a fundraising requirement. They expect them to bring in so many dollars per year as a board member. And hopefully they line that out for you when they ask, but they may not. And then you get in there and then you're on the hook to really have to provide some money. And not just your time. And a lot of times there's meeting attendance requirements and quorum and all of those things that you want to make sure you'll be able to fulfill your responsibilities as well.
So maybe it's similar answers, but if I'm John Q. Public and I kind of like the dog organization or the baby organization, but I don't want to give to an organization that's not responsible. What are the kinds of things that I could look for, and that then builds into, if I'm a nonprofit leader, these are the kinds of things I ought to be thinking about?
Yeah, so again, it does kind of go back to a lot of what's on the 990 out there as the public information. You can also just look at their website, and see what they've got going on, what they've been doing, what they claim their mission is, and what they think they're doing. On the 990, there'd be specific questions that you could look at, and those questions where they talk about the board member responsibilities, where it talks about who's selecting the board, different things like that. You could definitely look at that to see what's going on. And as a leader of a nonprofit, I think it's the same thing. You're making sure that everything out there is really what is going on. Like I said, if there's a scandal that comes up, that's when they're going to say, well, it said that you were doing this, but I haven't seen any of that going on, and it becomes, a bigger issue that you have to deal with.
Any other thing that you'd want to say to a nonprofit leader about how they should be transparent and accountability? For instance, annual reports or anything like that?
Yeah, I think annual reporting is great. Any type of annual report, even if it's a newsletter at the end of the year to say what we accomplished, that's something out there to be able to give to potential donors or your current donors so they know that their money was spent wisely. And then of course any type of annual financial statements. So, you're not necessarily required to have an audited financial statements. Sometimes some loans require it, or there may be other reasons why you might be required to have it. But even if you're not required, I would definitely encourage people to at least look into compilations or reviews or audits, so that way they could go through and see, they've got somebody else looking at it to kind of go through those and arrange what you've really got going on. I encourage people to do that. Just, it gives kind of a fresh set of eyes. It kind of adds that checks and balances as well. And a lot of times you can easily determine certain types of ratios with it.